Thank you, Chairperson and Task Force members, for this opportunity to present testimony in service of the critical need to develop reparation proposals for African Americans. I will not be showing any slides. A little bit of levity. I don't think at this point in a pandemic we need any more PowerPoints. You all did a beautiful job. So I'm going to really have some connection here around my original training and practice as a mental health, maternal health clinician, specifically as a nurse midwife. And what I recognized in doing that practice was a deep and pervasive impact of trauma, not just on the health of mothers and their infants, but on entire families. So for the last 15 years, I have refocused my work on the topics of stress, trauma, and resiliency in social service, education, and healthcare sectors, with a particular focus on marginalized, vulnerable, and oppressed populations. I primarily serve as a consultant and strategist for trauma-informed and equity-focused organizational development, and as a trainer for professionals willing to, and interested to grow competency in these areas. I am currently leading the Anti-Racism Initiative for the Los Angeles County Department of Health Services, the second largest safety net health system in the United States. I was asked to present my expertise on a particular aspect of racialized trauma that is little talked about, but which is pervasive and insidious in its damage, the phenomenon of appeasement. I will spend a moment defining appeasement, describing some of the physiology before detailing the serious implications for the health and spirits of African Americans. Appeasement is any relational behavior designed to pacify interpersonal threat. Although it exists on a larger continuum of strategies which help us get along with others, these behaviors vary according to the amount of perceived or actual power held by the parties involved. For example, when the power imbalance between people is relatively small, both parties might usefully and comfortably employ negotiation to come to a satisfactory resolution to a disagreement. Only when there are significant power differences does appeasement come into play. Appeasement asks for nothing from the person holding power except that they do not harm us. For the person with less power, appeasement is a survival strategy designed to let us live to fight another day. Appeasement is more than a culturally conditioned response to social hierarchy. Its roots stretch deep into our shared stress biology with other social animals, particularly mammals. I will offer a quick review of stress responses in order to clearly explain what is happening in appeasement and how it is relevant in racialized trauma. And I understand that we have varied degrees of medical training here, so I'm going to use some pretty simple language for accessibility, also for the public testimony, the public participants here. Often when we talk about stress response, we hear the term fight-flight, which describes the activation of the sympathetic nervous system with the resulting state of high adrenaline, coupled with increased blood pressure, blood sugar, and a cascade of other physiological reactions. This state is a normal defense response that is meant to be short-lived before a return to baseline. There is a second and less known stress or trauma response, commonly called a freeze response. This is when a threat is perceived to be so serious that movement to combat or escape the threat is essentially shut down by the autonomic and central nervous system, along with significant changes in the cardiovascular, hormonal, and other body systems. There is a gradient of intensity in this response. At its most extreme end, this is shock. This shock state, if prolonged in mammals, is not compatible with life, as opposed to if it in a reptile, it can last much longer in that state. Due to its intensity, the freeze response is intended for very short-term active reactions to highly threatening situations. So let me bring this to appeasement. In appeasement, there is substantial activation of both of these stress systems, both the fight-flight and the freeze systems simultaneously. However, the fight-flight system is not externally expressed. Instead, in essence, it is put on hold and almost frozen in place, as if hitting the gas of the fight-flight system and the freeze system at the same time. And while appeasement is a normal, natural part of our human response repertoire when confronted with social situations in which none of the other stress responses are seen as viable. In other words, we appease when the nature of the relationship makes escape impossible, defensive attack is not prudent, and playing dead is not realistic. More specifically, we appease in situations where the unequal power relationship is embedded in the life world of the victim. The latitude to fight or flee in response to a stressor or threat is often reserved only for those with significant social privilege, including that of white skin. The ability for a white person who is pulled over by law enforcement for speeding while driving, the ability for this person to argue their case, essentially fighting, is a privilege that is not afforded to Black people in this country. Even the latitude to run away when threatened is not freely given to African Americans. The history of this country to this current time is frequently punctuated over and over and over again by cases of unarmed, non-confrontational, and even fleeing Black people having been killed by law enforcement officers and white mobs enabled by law enforcement officers. These cases live in the hearts and minds and spirits of African Americans as a cautionary tale of the dangers of expressing the biologically driven fight-flight defense response. But this fight-flight response doesn't go away. Instead, it is literally frozen in place through the dual stress system activation of appeasement, which exacts a heavy energetic cost. In these contexts, it's fairly easy to see appeasement as a trauma response and a survival strategy. The appeaser faces a double bind of sorts. If they fully express the fight-flight defense response, they risk potential violence or other harms. But if they simultaneously freeze that fight-flight response in an act of appeasement, then they pay the heavy metabolic cost, the price of that dual stress system activation. This is biology and cultural conditioning influencing one another in both the response and the outcome. And it is not just in cases of interaction with law enforcement where appeasement responses come to bear. Black people face racialized social and power hierarchies in the workplace, in the classroom, and in the community. Black people face racially based threats, intimidations, and negative assumptions on an everyday basis. And the impact goes far beyond feeling hassled or irritated. I think my fellow presenters have done an excellent job of demonstrating that. What I want to highlight is that milder fight-flight and more intense freeze response are intended for short-term use. There is nothing wrong with them. We go up, we come down, short-term use. It is the remembering that a prolonged and pure freeze response is lethal in mammals, but even an extended time in fight-flight states means ongoing secretion of stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, with the attendant rises in blood pressure and blood sugar. And even without any medical training, it is very easy to see how a chronic fight-flight activation, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, could lead to hypertension and diabetes. And also remember that with appeasement, we have that dual activation, right? It's not just the fight-flight, it's also the freeze. So living with these daily experiences of racism induces a chronic overactivation of stress systems, which in turn induces a domino effect on interconnected biological systems that overcompensate and eventually collapse upon themselves. Physiological dysregulation and dysfunction produces widespread pathological changes. And again, my fellow presenters have done a tremendous job at example in the immune system, we see excessive inflammatory cytokines, autoimmunity, and immune suppression. In the brain, hippocampal atrophy with associated decreased memory of all types. Genetically, telomere shortening indicates accelerated cellular aging, life expectancy is shortened. The impact of appeasement is compounded by the fact that the escape is largely impossible. Black people must regularly interact with white people as a matter of practical survival. To understand what's going on when Black people engage in appeasement, it's critical that we see racism as continuously traumatic and the abusive intergroup dynamics of racism as a social context in which traumatic entrapment can be experienced and trauma responses should be expected. According to the psychology researcher Dr. Keltner, quote, appeasement begins when the conditions of social relations lead one individual to anticipate aggression from others, end quote. For African Americans, this means that expressions of modesty, politeness, agreeableness, shyness, uncertainty, and deference may instead be an attempt to deflect or prevent aggression from white people. Essentially, that these behaviors, again, modesty, politeness, agreeableness, shyness, uncertainty, and deference, in the context of intergroup relations with the power hierarchy associated with the privilege of light skin, are expressions of appeasement, can be expressions of appeasement. So when one lives in close and direct contact with members of a dominant social group, appeasing becomes so automatic that the appeaser may not actually even feel distressed in the moment, but instead, the cost comes later. The exhaustion, the chronic ill health across generations, the demoralization, the erosion of one's sense of dignity and self-worth. Thank you very much.